Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Glodine Brown, and I'm the general manager at CAFKA. So this year, CAFKA is celebrating its 20th anniversary. The CAFKA.21 biennial is taking place as a series of activations throughout the summer, bringing thought-provoking contemporary art to primarily outdoor public spaces across Kitchener, Waterloo, and Cambridge. CAFKA.21's theme, Everything Not Saved Will Be Lost, invites us to reflect on our everyday practices, our values, and our hopes. It also asks us to think about the things that could and perhaps should be left behind. We're pleased to be presenting Aruna D'Souza, An Art of Opacity, tonight in partnership with the Musagetes Foundation and the Arts Everywhere Festival. We at CAFKA are grieving and standing with the Indigenous community as they face the trauma of the horrific discoveries at residential school sites over the past several weeks. CAFKA acknowledges that we live and work on the traditional territory of the Adawandron, Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee people. The region of Waterloo is situated on Block 2 of the Haldimand Tract, land promised to Six Nations, which includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Six Nations of the Grand River, were granted this land to enjoy forever as part of the 1784 Haldimand Treaty with the British, after the Six Nations were dispossessed of their land in upstate New York following the American Revolution. The Haldimand Tract was reduced to less than 5% of this original territory in the over 200 years since, primarily through the loss of land to encroaching settlers. The Haudenosaunee Great Law emphasizes collective responsibilities and rights, and with this, the principle of the dish with one spoon, a treaty extended with the Anishinaabe and the British, which stipulated that the land was to be shared equally, collectively, and with the utmost attention paid to peaceful relations and the conservation of lands for future generations. As an organization composed of individual artists, arts workers, and community members with diverse backgrounds and histories, it is always our responsibility to learn, acknowledge, respect, and uphold the treaties made with indigenous nations and respect the right to land and life on unceded territories whose traditional caretakers continue to resist colonial violence today. We call on the community members to support local Indigenous organizations and to support the Woodland Cultural Centre in Brantford, Ontario, whose Save the Evidence campaign helps the site, the former Mohawk Institute Residential School, fulfill its mission as an educational resource. We have posted a list of these organizations that you can support, as well as other resources on our site at CAFKA.org/news. I'll quickly go over some housekeeping rules. So as per our community guidelines, we do have a zero tolerance policy for the use of slurs, offensive language, racism, or any other form of marginalization or discrimination. Any violation of these terms will result in the participant being removed from the session. We'd like to ensure that this virtual space is safe for everyone and welcome for everyone. We will be having a Q&A at the end, so please feel free to use the chat to ask your questions and also to make comments. And now I'm going to introduce our speaker for tonight. So Aruna D'Souza writes about modern and contemporary art, intersectional feminisms, and other forms of politics, and how museums shape our views of each other and the world. Her work appears regularly on forthcoming.org, where she is a member of the editorial advisory board and is a contributor to the New York Times. Her writing has also appeared in the Wall Street Journal, CNN.com, Art News, Garage, Bookforum, Momus, Art in America, and Art Practical, among other places. Her most recent book, Whitewalling, Art, Race, and Protest in 3 Acts, Badlands Unlimited, was named one of the best art books of 2018 by the New York Times. She is editing a forthcoming volume for Thames and Hudson, Making It Modern, Linda Nochlin Reader. She is also the editor of Lorraine O'Grady's Writing in Space, 1973 to 2018, Duke University Press 2020, and is the co-curator of the retrospective of O'Grady's work, Both/And, which opened in March 2021 at the Brooklyn Museum. Aruna.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Claudine, for the land acknowledgement that you gave and for the acknowledgement of how many people are mourning today. And I just want to extend my deepest sympathy to everyone who's in pain. But thank you. I learned so much from the land acknowledgement, which is always lovely. So thank you so much for having me. I am going to talk a little bit about and a set of ideas that's been sort of percolating in my mind for some time. And it's, you know, over the last few years, I've been talking about various ways in which I want people to be able to define themselves outside of the terms of others. And that sounds like a very sort of straightforward thing, right? We define ourselves on our own terms, not in the terms of others. But so many people in the world that we've set up, especially in the West, with the West as an idea, are, you know, the whole notion of self is very much defined by others. And so one of the things I have been really interested in over the last several years is the way in which the idea of empathy has been put up, sort of held up as an ideal for a kind of civil society, that we all must be empathetic towards each other in order to solve the problems. And although I think that I am a deeply empathetic person individually, I find it really troubling for us to talk about empathy as a political tool. And the reason that I say that is because you know, I don't want someone to have to understand me or understand what I'm going through in order to treat me as a human being. And certainly I don't want others to have to wait for me to catch up to understand their humanity, for, you know, to be able to expect me to treat them as human beings too. And one of the things that led me to was to think about the ways in which we are constantly asking each other or being asked by a kind of dominant society to explain ourselves, to translate ourselves into a language of the self that the majority can understand. And, you know, that works for very straightforwardly for people who live in Canada or the US who speak other languages. They're often forced to translate, you know, quite literally into a language that is not their own. But it also comes in terms of, it also affects people in terms of other markers of difference. And so, you know, that there's this constant demand for translation. And I started thinking about what a world would look like if translation wasn't required of us. You know, what would a world look like if, in order to be treated as human, in order to work in solidarity, in order to live alongside each other in, you know, in mutual care and peace of a sort, what what would it look like if we weren't constantly being asked to translate ourselves into the terms of a collective, but could merely exist within a collective without that act of translation? And my model for thinking about this is a novel by a writer named Amitav Ghosh called Sea of Poppies. It's not a very highbrow novel. It's actually kind of a page turner, but Amitav Ghosh writes in this novel about, it's a historical novel, and he is in addition to being a novelist, he's actually a linguist. And it's a novel that traces the journey of a ship from the American colonies, still under the British, the American colonies, to Europe, around the coast of the African continent, past Madagascar, around the coast of the Indian subcontinent to Calcutta. And the people on the ship in Calcutta, which is, certainly in the 17th century, was one of the major global hubs for, transportation hubs. It was a major port city. It was a site of a tremendous transfer of wealth. The ship ends up there, and the people on the ship, who are sailors who have been picked up all along the way, all along the circuitous global route, end up coming into contact with people of various castes and backgrounds, as well as English colonists or members of the British East India Company, English merchants who have come to India and made their fortune. And none of these people speak what we would think of as standard English. Even the English people speak in this novel, they speak in the language of late 18th, early 19th century British Raj. And so British colonists. And the most amazing thing about this book is that Amitav Ghosh doesn't translate anything. And so you have people speaking the sailors on these ships are speaking something called Lascar, which is a sort of mishmash language that was developed really for sailors who often found themselves having to work with people who spoke Swahili, who spoke English, who spoke various dialects, East Asian dialects, who spoke Indian dialects, who spoke other African dialects. All of these people were on ships, and so they spoke a language that was really a kind of mishmash language that reflected this diversity on the ship. And then they arrive at this port, and you have very poor Indians who speak almost no English. You have a Maharaja who has been educated at Oxford and speaks the closest thing that we would consider to modern day standard English. You have Britishers who are speaking in this really incredibly complex and hard to parse Old English, and all of this is going on, and these characters, despite the fact that they don't speak a common language, manage to communicate, and the narrative goes forward even though they don't entirely understand each other. And the book ends with a kind of revolutionary kind of moment that's created, even though none of these people speak the same language in a very real sense. And what's extraordinary to me, even more extraordinary to me about the book, is that Ghosh doesn't translate for the reader either. So you start reading the book and you have no idea what's going on, or I had no idea what was going on for some of it. And you just have to, in a sense, ride the waves of the language and kind of go with the flow, because and after a certain point, you discover that you also are understanding enough to make out what's happening. And it seemed to me such an interesting lesson in a kind of humility for a reader like me who really has English and a little bit of French, not nearly enough considering, I'm not nearly fluent enough considering I'm Canadian, but I've got some French and some English. But for someone like me who's, pretty monolingual, it was and yet whose first language is the language that has sort of been imposed around the world and is a kind of lingua franca around the world. It was a really interesting lesson in humility of what it means not to understand, what it means for the world to happen around me without being translated into my terms, right? And I started thinking about that as a woman of color. In a sense, I often have to translate myself into a language of the majority, and thinking about the ways in which translation functions and can function in creating these sort of coalitions of solidarity that don't require us all to sign on to speak the same language, to have exactly the same worldview, that I don't have to sort of subsume my individual needs or the needs of my community in order to enter into a relationship of solidarity with others who have their communities, their needs, their particular points of view to bring to the table. So this is all a long preamble to say that I was this last year, last summer, kind of blown away by reading a book by the author Saidiya Hartman. Sorry, I'm just making sure I press the right button here. A book by Saidiya Hartman called Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, Intimate Histories of Social Upheaval, which is a fascinating book that she has written about the lives of Black women in cities, mostly New York, in the early 20th century. So after the putative end of slavery, still while Jim Crow laws were rampant in the South, she's taught, she's making she's telling the stories of these women who came up north often in order to escape Jim Crow laws in the South. So these laws that were enacted to essentially in the South extend slavery in the US South, even though the practice itself had been outlawed. So these Jim Crow laws were ways of essentially getting around the illegality of slavery by rendering by severely curtailing anything like freedom for the formerly enslaved or other Black people who were their descendants. So she's talking about these young women who came up to the North, and what they found in the North was that there were, even though they weren't codified as Jim Crow laws, there were ways in which certain kinds of legal structures in the Northern US were continuing to function to criminalize and pathologize the lives of these of younger Black people. And so what's remarkable about this book, though, is that to tell a history of these young women, Hartman has to either she either has to rely on an archive that has been compromised at its very root by white supremacy, built according to white supremacist categorizations and organization of knowledge, or she has no archive. And so she talks about Wayward Lives as an exercise in articulating Black subjective experience in the absence of an archival record, or rather in full recognition of the ways in which that experience, when it is described in the archive, is most often done so through a lens of whiteness that can only see Black people as criminal, degenerate, or deviant. Her stories of the experiences of young Black women living in northern cities during what she calls the afterlife of slavery, creating radical new ways of surviving through acts of imagination, and while refusing the terms of visibility imposed on themselves, are an act of détournement, of upending the disciplinary function of the historical record and supplementing it with that which could never have been or recorded or remembered, because the mechanisms of seeing and recording and remembering were that of white supremacy. So, so part of this, part of what she's talking about is the way in which these young Black women, on the one hand, were often exploited, made visible, sexualized, made examples of, humiliated in the street. And on the other hand, ways in which they themselves found ways to elude visibility, to make themselves invisible to the archive. And so her project then is very self-consciously treads a very sort of delicate line between both wanting to imagine a past for them, but also not wanting to pull them into clear visibility when they had been themselves protecting themselves by making themselves invisible. And I'm just, one of the very beautiful things about the book is that there is a very careful thought. There's very careful thought that goes into the relationship of text to image. And the book is illustrated with a lot of archival imagery. But in this case, what you're seeing is a section of the book in which she is imagining the life of, or the reaction, or the situation of a young Black child who is photographed nude by the American 19th century painter Thomas Eakins. And this photograph was found in Eakins' archive, and Saidiya Hartman talks about it, but does this very interesting thing, interesting especially for a prose book, not, that's, in a way it's very Zabaldian, but she does this really interesting thing of putting the text over the image, so that this sort of, so that we have to encounter a kind of reckoning with the young girl's subjectivity before we're able to see the image itself, or the image itself is not entirely available to our view. But I thought this idea of the question of invisibility in relation to these other ideas of the refusal of translation, or the rejection of empathy, I started thinking of this as potentially very interesting, partly because I was seeing it so much reflected in the art of a number of artists whose work that I have been very interested in. And that includes, sorry, I'm just going to skip that for a second. And through reading more around these artists, I came across the work of Édouard Glissant, who was intellectual from the Caribbean who resided in France for some time, and who wrote about visibility and invisibility as a political possibility or potentiality when he wrote about what he called the right to opacity. And I'm just going to give you, read a little bit of what he wrote to give you a sense of what his notion of opacity was, the right to opacity. So he says, if we examine the process of understanding people and ideas from the perspective of Western thought, we discover that its basis is this requirement for transparency. In order to understand and thus accept you, I have to measure your solidity with the ideal scale, providing me with grounds to make comparisons and perhaps judgments. I have to reduce. He says, perhaps we need to bring an end to the very notion of a scale. Displace all reduction. Agree not merely to the right to difference, your right to be different, but carrying this further, agree also to your right to opacity, that is not enclosure within an impenetrable autarky, but subsistence within an irreducible singularity. Opacities can exist and converge, weaving fabrics. To understand these truly, one must focus on the texture of the weave and not the nature of its components. For the time being, perhaps, give up this old obsession with discovering what lies at the bottom of nature's. To feel solidarity with the other, or to build with him, or to like what he does, it is not necessary for me to grasp him. And when he writes that when he thinks about the word grasp, he thinks about this idea of squeezing with the hand. He says it's not necessary for me to grasp him. It is not necessary to try to become the other, nor to make him in my image. So just as Amitav Ghosh was talking about translation and mistranslation, and the possibility that we need not all translate ourselves into the language of the other, and just as Saidiya Hartman was talking about the right to visibility and invisibility, here is Glissant talking about the right to opacity, the right to not make ourselves fully transparent to the views of others. And of course, Glissant was talking in the context of colonialism and empire. And so for him, this was very much about the right of the colonized to not open itself up to the gaze of the colonizer, as well as to the gaze of the colonizer's forms of research, right? Anthropology, sociology, ethnography, linguistics, all of those things that are very much about trying to understand the colonized, trying to, in a sense, dissect the colonized the way that you would dissect a frog in a lab experiment. And so the right to opacity was, in fact, a right in Glissant to be treated as human. And that seems to me a pretty powerful sort of notion, and certainly one that runs through, I think, a number of the work of a number of artists, of Black artists working in the US right now. So I want to talk about some of those right now. In 2018, Simone Lee won the Guggenheim Museum's Hugo Boss Prize. The solo exhibition she created to mark the occasion, which ran from April to October 2019, Loophole of Retreat, continued the artist's practice of creating large, even monumental ceramic sculptures, objects that take up space, objects that make their presence felt, that simultaneously argue for invisibility, inscrutability, and opacity as a space of freedom for articulating Black feminine subjectivity, and map a history of Black female creativity and intellectual engagement. The title of the show referred to the extraordinary story of Harriet Jacobs, whose autobiography, Life of a Slave Girl, tells the story of a 7-year stretch during which Jacobs hid in a crawl space less than 3 feet high in order to claim a defiant autonomy from her status under the racist logic of slavery. Withdrawal into invisibility was the loophole in which agency and self-determination could be exerted, no matter the conditions under which it was conceived. Lee's work, especially so in this show, explored ways in which the refusal to be seen was the only way in which the real work of articulating Black female subjectivity could happen. In a text written on the occasion of Lee's Hugo Boss Prize win, Sharifa Rhodes Pitts notes, "The first words I ever heard Simone Lee say were, 'My primary audience is Black women.' Indeed, the artist's practice refuses to engage with the ways in which Black women have been seen by the white gaze. The white gaze is of no consequence to her, even despite the hypervisibility of Black women in the white supremacist imagination. Instead, she privileges Black women's own self-imaginings. But it is also very much rooted in a desire to get on with the work in the face of a white audience's ignorance, sometimes willful ignorance of the terms in which she is working and which she shares with a broader community of thinkers and makers." In an Instagram post of May 2019, in which she complains about initial responses to that year's Whitney Biennial, which saw it as somehow not sufficiently radical, you hear in her voice an echo of Toni Morrison's reminder that racism operates through distraction, keeping you from doing your work by making you answer white supremacy's calls for legitimacy. Lee's Instagram post reads as follows: "I've seen some preliminary thoughts in the biennial and concerns about radicality. I need to say that if you haven't read not a single thing written by Saidiya Hartman or Hortense Spillers, and if you have no knowledge, never heard of negritude or how it's related to surrealism, if you don't know who Senghor is or why he would have anything to do with art, if you never spent any time figuring out who was and wasn't at Festac 77, if you have no idea what critical fabulation is, if you don't know what I meant when I said in the wake, if you never studied independence architecture, if you don't know why Pauline Lumumba walked through the streets of Kinshasa bare-breasted, if you have no idea who Catherine Dunham is or her scholarship, but yet you consider yourself well-versed in the work and contributions of the woman she hired as a secretary, Maya Deren, if the words Black feminist thought bring absolutely zero concepts to mind, if the words Dave the Potter mean nothing to you, if you didn't ponder the significance of Sharifa's unruly kitchen when she embodied Uhura in my video, and you don't even know what a kitchen is, if the words Dogon statuary conjures nothing, if the only thing you know about Benin bronzes is that Europe stole them, if you casually use words like ethnic, exotic, and tribal, and you still think that those are useful words, if you don't know what story I'm referring to when I talk about a question of power, if you thought I was being weird when I told you I was too busy sharpening my oyster knife, if you've never heard of the Herero genocide, then you lack the knowledge to recognize the radical gestures in my work And that is why, instead of mentioning these things, I have politely said that women, Black women, are my primary audience. This declaration is a refusal, but it's a very generous one. At the same time as she explains her decision to focus on Black women, both as a source and audience for her work, she gives the rest of us the tools to enter into her conceptual world. And really, that Instagram post is still, for me, I consider it a kind of syllabus of things that I need to check off the list of things to understand and know. The centerpiece of Lee's Guggenheim exhibition, an installation titled, like the show, Loophole of Retreat, you're seeing it right here, was installed in the rear of the gallery, behind a screen of ornamental blocks often used to build breezeways in the South. One finds a sculpture called Village Series number 14. The enclosure is ambivalent. The writer Nzinga Simmons describes it as a prison cell and a sacred space. The work was inspired by Lee's interest in the experience of Debbie Africa, a member of the Philadelphia-based Black revolutionary organization MOVE. She was one of 9 members of the group who was arrested in 1978 after the shooting death of a police officer during a standoff. In 1985, in an act of retribution, the police bombed their enclave, which resulted in the death of 6 adults and 5 children under the age of 13, and the destruction of 65 houses in close proximity, the razing of a whole community. That was in 1985. And some of you may have heard recently that it was revealed that the remains of the children who were killed, the 5 children who were killed, were actually given to the museum at the University of Pennsylvania. Oops, I don't know why that's going ahead. They were actually given to the museum at the University of Pennsylvania for study purposes back in 1985, which would have been bad enough, except that it was revealed recently that they had been lost, in fact, by the museum, which revived the pain of this sort of very callous treatment for many people. In any case, a short time into her prison term, Debbie Africa, who was 8 months pregnant at the time of her incarceration, gave birth. She was able to keep her infant by her side for 3 days, thanks to her fellow inmates. Those women, many of whom were Black, sang songs and coughed and made noises to distract the guards from the fact that a baby had been born. Lee, in an interview, termed this an act of sonic protection. Working with Philadelphia-based musician and poet Moore Mother, Lee created an audio component for the installation that suggests, through the layering of sound, the experience of this act of sheltering a Black woman's intimate experience from the white gaze. Pop music from 1978, the sound of the MOVE bombing, the noises created during a protest in February 2019 at a men's prison in Brooklyn when the power and heat went off for a week during a record cold snap. For Lee, like for the women whose stories Hartman tells in Wayward Lives, invisibility, the refusal of the white gaze, is a form of power. Loophole of retreat, finding a space beyond the visible in which subjectivity can be enacted in freedom. In a very different way, the painter Jennifer Packer depicts people she loves and honors, friends, family, fellow artists, writers, and curators, all of whom are Black, in a manner that insists upon their full humanity, that refuses the propensity of traditional portraiture to serve up those depicted to the viewer's gaze, no matter how impressive or powerful they are. Packer's portraits are as startlingly intimate as they are hard to grasp. The figures often merge into or coalesce from their backgrounds, and the sketchy, even agitated lines Packer employs in their depictions obscure as much as they reveal. In Jess, from 2018. You're seeing that on the left. Her friend's crossed legs scarcely register as such. And her clasped hands are a miasma of interlaced fingers. The bodies of the artists hanging out and here you see Lost in Translation from 2013. Similarly, this painting of a nude female body moves in and out of focus, emerges as if it's emerging from water, as an array of different body parts. But in addition to being hard to put together visually, the face is entirely obscured. And so we have a refusal of the ways in which the nude is also offered up to the male gaze, the white gaze, here in both cases. Sometimes insisting on the sovereignty of her subjects involves withdrawing them entirely from view, right? As the media fills with images of the broken bodies of victims of extrajudicial police murders, Packer presents us with alternative images of the lives that were ended. Works like Say Her Name, which was made in the wake of the death of Sandra Bland in police custody, offer up bouquets of flowers. The play between representation and abstraction in these paintings is almost impossible to parse, as they honor the lost by insisting on the fleeting and ungraspable beauty of life. So a refusal to depict the body of the dead in order for the person who died to retain a kind of dignity and a right to privacy, a right to invisibility, a right not to offer herself up to the devouring gaze, which I think is very much related in her work to Glissant's notion. And I think that I'm eagerly anticipating an essay that the scholar Christina Sharp has written about Jennifer Packer's work on the occasion of a recent solo exhibition at the Serpentine Gallery in London. The catalog is not out yet, but hopefully it will be out soon, because I think that she speaks there of this connection with Glissant as well. So you're going to have to excuse some of these photos, which are really just my iPhone camera photos from seeing this video in a recent exhibition at an art space called Pioneer Works in Brooklyn. A video by Rose-Janan Uddoh, a young British video and performance artist, is screened in a black box lined with heavy curtains, which seems appropriately theatrical given the subject matter on view. Titled Black Poirot, the video is a witty, and for me, who I'm pretty sure has read every single Agatha Christie novel since I was 13 years old, it is even a mind-blowing rereading of one of the most famous characters in mystery writing, Agatha Christie's eccentric Belgian detective, who, in over 30 novels, as well as in plays and short stories, circulated among the British aristocracy, helping them solve their embarrassing murders, robberies, and scandals. Intertitles in Uddoh's video are rendered in an ornate sans serif typeface that comes from old paperback editions of the book. I used to have my copies of some of the novels had this particular typeface on them. And they indicate that Uddoh's video is structured according to the sort of standard way that Christie structured her novels, right? So they read: Poirot arrives at the gate of the manor house. The various characters are introduced. Poirot interviews the inhabitants. Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard hastily arrests the wrong person. Hastings, we must return to the scene of the crime, and so on. But what we see in Uddoh's revision is very far from the old familiar Hercule. Instead, what Uddoh offers us is a completely revisionist history of Poirot, in which she asserts that structurally, Poirot, who is treated as not just other by most of the aristocratic characters in the book, but as lesser by them, who is constantly being second-guessed by the people around him, who is constantly having to translate himself, even though he speaks perfectly proper English, who is constantly being sort of side-eyed as the foreigner, that that Poirot is in fact, according to Uddoh, Black. You see the subtitles on some of these, or on the left, the foreigner with nowhere else but our hostile England to call home. Uddoh is British. And then the last intertitle of the last section of the film is Black Poirot reveals the Western epistemological project, AKA the insistence on constantly asking why, what, who done it, of every individual as a colonialist plot. So what she says is that in this video, what she sort of argues, and it's very cleverly done, I have to say, what she argues is that the structure of the mystery novel is the structure of colonialism, that the structure of the mystery novel is an attempt to reveal the truth, to find the murderer, to uncover, to sort of examine all the clues and uncover people's motivations and lay their desires and their hatreds sort of transparent. And that was also the project of colonialism in relation to those who were colonized. And so that his going through this whole process was a sort of revelation of the colonialist underpinning of this very sort of innocent genre of writing. And one of the arguments she makes in the video, because it also includes these scenes from the David Suchet, and in this case, Peter Ustinov versions of Poirot mysteries, are intercut with images of other Black musicians, intellectuals, writers, and artists who she talks about, but she ends up saying that the person who, if she were to cast a new version or a version of a Black Poirot, that the person who should play Poirot is Édouard Glissant. This is a sort of, again, a very different view, but still something that's sort of playing with this idea of the refusal of vision. Sandra Perry has spoken about her interest in how Blackness shifts, morphs, and embodies technology to combat oppression and surveillance. This agility is hauntingly apparent in Double, Quadruple, etc., 1 and 2, which you're seeing here on the right and left, an eerily silent 2-channel video loop. On adjacent screens, 2 performers, the artists Danny Giles and Joyri Minaya, dance, each against the corner of a white painted room. Using the content-aware patch tool in Photoshop, which enables the removal of unwanted elements from images, Perry has covered almost all of their bodies. Flashes of brown skin and the constant presence of braided hair keep the performers from dissolving into pure abstraction. But at the same time, they elude identification. We cannot see them, even as we cannot tear our eyes away from them. So we're looking essentially at bodies for this video, as we're standing there, we're looking at bodies that we can't see, more or less can't see. And I think this play of this idea of these figures existing, and we know they exist, but we cannot identify them, you know, is really powerful at the point that, you know, we're living, for many of us, in countries where state surveillance through the police, through other security agencies is a real issue. Nick Cave, an artist who has been addressing Black history for decades through costumes that render the body all but invisible, likewise presents a Blackness that cannot be pinned down, that confounds definition or fixed form, while at the same time acknowledging the ways that our culture projects its worst fantasies and fears upon it. In Blot from 2012, a figure clothed in one of the artist's signature sound suits, composed of layers upon layers of fringed fabric, inspired in part by West African ceremonial costumes, is mirrored around a central axis. The by-turn smooth and sudden movements of the performer transform before our eyes into a succession of Rorschach tests. We might see faces or skulls or birds or African masks over the course of the 43-minute video. Even the sound is multivalent, produced only by the fabric of the costume brushing against itself. It is at the same time oceanic, like waves lapping the shore. And I just want to end with, in fact, a kind of paradoxical example of of artists who are thinking about the kind of withdrawal from view of visibility, the invisibility as a space of possibility, and that is the artist, the photographer Dawoud Bey, who is the subject of a current retrospective exhibition at the Whitney Museum right now. And the reason that it's so paradoxical to talk about him in these terms is that he is best known for his photographs of people. He is best known for a portraiture practice that has developed over the past, since the 70s, that was really about making space, making visual space for Black people. He started taking photographs of Harlem that were very much inspired by people like Roy DeCarava, by Gordon Parks, by James Vandersea, photographs of sort of daily life of people living their best lives, as they say, in Harlem, in a neighborhood that has long been the home of a vital African-American community in the US. But he was, unlike a lot of street photographers, he was very interested in finding ways to give his photographic subjects a kind of agency, so that they weren't just objects of the camera's gaze, that they were in fact actors in their own right. And so he switched out his 35mm camera for a large 4x5 camera that required a tripod. And he began to make, instead of street photographs, he began to make street portraits. And he did a series of, they were called Polaroid portraits in the late 80s and early 90s that in different places, in Amityville, in Brooklyn, here you see in the Bronx, in Harlem, in Syracuse, in Chicago, in multiple places. But in these situations, he actually set up his camera and asked people to present themselves. in, as he spoke to them, they decided how they wanted to be seen. And they're, as you can see, they're extraordinary pictures. But what's interesting is that he was looking for ways in which not just to make his portrait subjects visible, but to make his portrait subjects active within the photographic process. But the series of works of his that I want to talk about actually is this series that was begun in 2017. In 2017, Dawoud Bey created a series of velvety, shadowy photographs of the sites and routes in Ohio that people likely traveled to flee enslavement, elusive, sometimes imagined traces of the Underground Railroad. He called it Night Coming Tenderly Black. These nighttime images are made from the point of view of those trying to escape unimaginable horrors, for whom darkness was a form of safety and protection. The series title comes from a poem by Langston Hughes, Dream Variation from 1926, in which the poet imagines a world in which he is both free, quote, to fling my arms wide in some place of the sun, to whirl and to dance till the white day is done, and later to find comfort in, quote, night coming tenderly, black like me. It's a gorgeous poem, and it's beautiful, I think, partly because of its conception of Blackness as a space of tenderness. And Bey takes this idea and translates it into this series of photographs in which darkness, Blackness, are in fact the space of safety, the space in which freedom can be experienced. And again, none of these pictures include people, which is unusual for him, but they are shot, as you can see from here, the camera takes the position, they are shot from the point of view of who Bey imagines must have been running along the route of the Underground Railroad, who must have been the people who must have been sort of finding protection in the darkness, in the forests, in the various homes along the way until they reach the shores of Lake Erie in this case. Just one thing that absolutely amazed me, charmed me. On Instagram not long ago, Dawoud was talking about watching the HBO, I think, series, The Underground Railroad, based on the book written by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And he showed us a kind of still from the series, and he said, I don't know if it's just me, but this looks like this looks a little like my photo. And he had actually was comparing it to the photo that you see on the left, the picket fence and farmhouse. And the director of the series is Barry Jenkins, who's also the director of the achingly beautiful film Moonlight. He actually came on to Dawoud Bey's Instagram to say, actually, I came up to you after a lecture back in 1992 in San Francisco to tell you I was a fan, and since then I've been a huge fan of your work, and we definitely paid homage to your photographs in our production of the Underground Railroad and in our conception of Blackness and darkness as a place of safety, rather than a kind of place in which you had to fear invisibility, a place in which you could take succor in invisibility. So it was a lovely kind of acknowledgement, I think, of the impact that Bey has had as a photographer, but also on the way that he's creating these sorts of terms for imagining Black historical experience in very formal ways, using the possibilities of the camera to offer new ways of imagining spaces of freedom. So with that, I'm going to stop my share and see if anyone has any questions. Thank you first all for taking the time to spend with me, but yeah.
Thank you, that was a lovely talk. Just to check, give us a second here. Okay, if anybody has any questions, you can type them in the chat. Oh,
Right.
let's see. Yeah, we have a question. So I love Nick Cave's work. Are there any other pieces of his that you'd recommend? Thank you.
I think that all of Nick Cave's movement pieces are quite extraordinary, and the sound suits are they're so fascinating because they are so self-contained. They are so they produce their own music through movement, and I think that it's a great sort of it's a great way of mining the often mostly West African dance traditions that he builds upon. So I think that's terrific. But it's I think it's also they're also so empowering for the people in the suits. And so I live very close to Mass MoCA, which is a very big contemporary art space in New England, and he did a long-term project with Mass MoCA over the last few years, or a few years ago. And what was fun is that when he sought dancers for his pieces, he actually reached out to the local community and asked anyone who wanted to take part. And so there was something really beautifully democratic, let's say, about his conception of dance and of sound making, and of drawing people into this space of that is rooted in a whole set of traditions that often get ignored within the white dance world. So I would just say explore it all, really. But look into the Mass MoCA project. It was quite beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I saw his work. I've seen his work before, but I saw a piece in person the beginning of last year in Detroit. It was part of a personal collection. It was amazing to see in person. It was fantastic. We have some thank yous. So thank you. And we have a comment that says, brilliant talk, Aruna. Grateful to have witnessed it.
Thank you, Candace. I actually wanted to say, just thinking about, one of the things that I've also been thinking about is the way in which Glissant's notion of the right to opacity intersects with a lot of Indigenous scholarships work on a notion of extractive knowledge, and the idea that that scholars who have approached the kind of study of Indigenous communities have often done so with the idea of needing to extract Indigenous knowledge. And so there's a great book that I read last year and spoke with its author. Dylan Robinson wrote a book on Indigenous sound practices called Hungry Listening. And it's also a terrific book. It's about sound, but he really takes seriously this idea of how does he, as an Indigenous scholar, write about this work without making all of what he knows available to the non-Indigenous gaze. And so there's a great point in the book where he says, okay, now, if you're not Indigenous, please don't read the next 80 pages, skip forward to this page. And there's this sort of fantastic ethical problem that one has of, you know, of saying like, okay, am I going to honor this request and not look at things which Indigenous people, an Indigenous person is asking me not to look at, or do I defy it in the quest for the complete knowledge of a subject? So, you know, I think that I've been thinking about that in relation to this idea of the right to opacity as well. But I just wanted to recommend that book, you know, in case people are interested.
Yeah. To follow up to the Nick Cave question, I'd never thought about what the experience of the dancers must be like. Thanks so much. Question about your future research. I'm curious where you think this body of research will take you in the future. What are you looking to explore in the near future?
Well, you know, my work, I am constantly in the process of defining what I am or who I am as a writer. I, for a long time, I didn't call myself an art critic because I wanted my writing to be a little different. I wasn't planning on being a kind of person who just reviewed shows all the time and who even had the platform to do that. But more recently, I've started writing for the New York Times, and so there's possibilities I realize of having a platform that's that large. I would like to get my mind around this material and thinking about the ways in which artists are exploring these ideas of invisibility and the contradictions, the freedom offered by invisibility or opacity. So I think I'd like to sort of pursue this, but you know, as with anything, having the time to do it between my other deadlines and the deadlines that pay the bills is always a challenge. So that's where I am with that. But you know, I find you know, for me, so much of thinking about this has been driven by the artists that I've been looking at. And there's so many artists thinking so intelligently about these questions, whether or not it comes through Glissant or through Saidiya Hartman, through Christina Sharp, that, you know, I'd be silly not to pursue those interests. So.
Question. Thank you, Aruna, so much. That was such a beautiful talk that you took us through. I'm going back through my notes and was wondering if you could speak to the connection between the refusal of translation and the refusal of visibility through Hartman and Glissant, because one is more textual while the other is visual. And now with Dylan's work also, where might oral resonate in the intertextual or image? Thank you. Well, linguist,
Yeah.
sorry, just correction, they meant linguistic meaning for textual.
Yeah. So this is, and this relates to the last question, in fact, is that I am still figuring that out. I think that, I mean, in a sense, I don't want to draw the connection between what Ghosh is doing and what Saidiya Hartman is doing too closely, because I don't think Ghosh was thinking about Glissant or thinking about Saidiya Hartman. Saidiya Hartman hadn't written her book by the time Ghosh, you know, at the time Ghosh wrote his. But what I'm fascinated with is that there is this constellation of thinking around the idea of of withholding, of refusing, of not feeling obligated to supply, to meet expectations, to supply what is being asked of one, as a form of resistance. That protest may not look like moving out into the streets and putting your bodies in front of the police or whatever. That resistance may look like withdrawing entirely from view. And I think, Simone Lee's work is so fascinating because she has engaged with so many histories where, people have operated in real secrecy in order to further political aims. And she's, there's one organization, historical organization in the US of Black women who were nurses who had a sort of a completely secret organization where they worked separately from the sort of official healthcare system in order to provide healthcare for people. And the secrecy was sort of necessary for them to be able to do this work without being overseen by a white medical authority. And so, there's so many examples of, I think, that her work sort of elucidates of these sorts of moments in which the real work of liberation is happening outside of the white gaze, right? Outside of the gaze of the state of white supremacy, of white people. And I find that really interesting to think about as a model, because right now I think it's so easy for protest, for politics to be co-opted. The artist Lorraine O'Grady calls it 30-dimensional chess, right? Anytime someone protests, it'll be absorbed back into the state. So yeah, so I am interested in the ways in which these ideas are being articulated in really different context: Indigenous studies, post-colonial studies, Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation, Amitav Ghosh's novels, but that they're all sort of they're all out there, but not necessarily working. They're not coming necessarily from the same place. But it's sort of a nice demonstration, right, of we don't all have to be speaking the same language in order to be pushing the conversation forward as well. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. Oh, sorry, my dog is just...
Can you share the book titles you've mentioned on this issue of Opacity, Resistance to the Gaze? So interesting.
I'm gonna hope that my dog is quiet. He just heard someone at the door. So, I mean, the big ones. Oh, I'm sorry. There's no one else in the house and my dog is going crazy, so I just had to check on her. So the big books that I'd recommend, obviously I'd recommend reading through Glissant, which is something that I am still in the process of doing. I would recommend, I really highly recommend Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Lives. I think it's really one of the best things that I've read in a long time, and it's a page turner. I don't know, it's just so beautiful and so compelling. I think that that's a really important place in a sense to start. Dylan Robinson's Hungry Listening was really transformative for me as well. He teaches at Queen's, university. So yeah, so I would say, I think, those are good places to start. And then, of course, there's the classic writings on the male gaze that I think, offer possibilities for translation into notions of the white gaze as well. So anyway.
Right, we have a comment, retreat as protest. Yes, yes, thank you. With the incisive criticism Simone Lee provided on her Instagram that you spoke about tonight, I wanted to ask if you have any thoughts about how the refusal of translation could radically shift the field of art criticism.
So this is something that I am really aware of. And I think that it's one of the reasons that I have been trying to advocate for more Black editors in art magazines and the spaces of art criticism, because I think that it's really one of the problems, I think, of art criticism right now is that a lot of publications are really want their criticism to be available to, understandable by the sort of universal reader, right? Like the general reader, this abstract ideal reader who's, reads at a 8th grade level and, and has a certain amount of knowledge of the world, but, is not an expert and all of this stuff. So fine, I'm completely in favor of writing for a generalist audience. But what I think a lot of publications don't understand is that they, whether or not they're aware of it, they define a general reader as a white reader. And so there are certain things that, I will say that among the people that I read, among the people who read my work, among the people who, I talk to about art, or life or culture or whatever. To us, it's obvious, right? It doesn't need defining. But for people who are only steeped in the kind of art or culture or world of whiteness, it needs translating. And so, what I find is that when I'm writing about Black artists, but working with white editors, or writing about South Asian artists, working with white editors, whatever it is, that there's an anxiety about, oh, you'll need to translate this for the reader. You'll need to translate, you'll need to explain, you'll need to make this clearer. And, in some cases, maybe it is useful. In other cases, it's by doing that translation, you're making it very clear who you're imagining your reader is. And so, there, and it's interesting how it works out. Like I had a recent review and my editor is fantastic, in this case, my editor is fantastic, but we sat there and we were having this like tug of war over whether to use they or we in a certain sentence. And it was hilarious because I was saying, I was in this position of realizing I was imagining a Black reader of my writing, and I am not Black. And so I had to try and figure out how to both acknowledge that my readers may be Black, but not simply other them by acknowledging that I myself am not Black. So we wasn't working, they wasn't working, right? And so it was a really sort of interesting moment of saying like, okay, like how does one translate these really complex notions of solidarity and respectfulness of difference in this tiny little space of writing, right? This tiny little half sentence. So, you know, I do think that the rise of more publications focused on Black, Indigenous, other artists of art produced by people of color, the rise of the inclusion of more Black and Indigenous and other POC editors at mainstream art publications. I think that's one way in which this sort of constant need for constant obligation to translate might kind of soften itself. And you know, I think, like, you know, the fact is that if I know that people aren't if I read something where I realize that people are speaking my language, whatever language that is, my language of art criticism, you know, I read more, you know, and I think that, you know, for so many publications, their assumption of like one standard reader, and, you know, the unstated assumption that that standard reader is white, limits an audience. So I'm not sure why anyone would want to avoid that. So.
Okay. Somebody says white-splaining.
Well, it's, yeah, or translating into whiteness, one or the other, definitely.
Okay. Does anybody have any further questions? Oh, it looks like that might be it.
Anyone? I'm willing to answer questions about anything, really. So please jump in if anything else strikes you. Oh, look, so many. I just looked at the participants list, and so many people I know. So sweet. Oh. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
It's nice to feel supported. Yeah.
It is. It's lovely.
I have a question about the Lorraine O'Grady show. How long is it going to be on for?
So it runs through mid-July or late July. There's you know, the exhibition is, because Lorraine O'Grady intervened in so many sort of aspects of art historical discourse and artistic discourse. She was critiquing white supremacy, white feminism. She was critiquing Egyptology. She was critiquing 19th century American landscape painting. She was critiquing all of this. She was critiquing European notions of chivalry, right? Like she was, you know, in her work. We made the decision to install her work throughout the Brooklyn Museum. So it's in the Egyptian galleries, it's in the American landscape galleries, it's in the European galleries, it's in the feminist center. So she's intervening in all of these places. And one of the exciting things is that I think that the curators of the American galleries, right? So, you know, at a big museum, all the curators of all these different areas, the curators in charge had to sort of sign on to this grand plan of taking over their space, which, you know, is a bit delicate, right? Curators like to keep their space to do their work, but at least one of the pieces in the American galleries, this sort of incredible video called Landscape Western Hemisphere, which is a video that Lorraine shot of her hair blowing around. And Lorraine is a Black woman who's, you know, at some point in her lineage has also European ancestry, as do many people from the Americas who were brought via slavery to North America. And so she has this sort of biracial sort of genetic heritage. And so she did this fantastic video of her hair blowing in the wind, and there were different, you can see the different curl patterns and the way that her hair goes from really sort of silky and straight to very tightly curled in different sections of her hair. And she overlaid that image with a soundtrack that has different ambient sounds, but the sounds are very distinct. And so you can hear yourself on a tropical beach in Jamaica. Her family is from Jamaica originally, and you can hear the sounds then of the Boston waterfront, or, you know, a kind of New England forest. And you know, reflecting another aspect of, you know, she's biracial, but she's also has these Caribbean origins, but was raised in New England. And it's a really smart kind of reflection on the ways in which, because it looks like a landscape, it looks like you're looking at the leaves of trees blowing in the wind, or you're looking at waves on the water. And it's a really sort of brilliant reflection on the ways in which the northern, the West, right? This, you know, the Americas, this sort of post-contact Americas, have been sort of built on the backs of people who have either been forced to come here against their will, or who have been the victims of genocide by colonists, and the ways in which those bodies very much shape the continents, the North and South America. And so it's a really subtle critique of these sort of grandiose American landscape paintings of the American West and all of this stuff, which show none of that history, right? They don't show none of the history of the sort of the violence of settler colonialism. They show none of the history of the violence of enslavement. And so having this video in those galleries is really eye-opening. So it's exciting that the curators of the American galleries want to keep that there longer, because I think it really makes its point.
Oh, thank you. We have a question. So earlier this week, your book Whitewalling was part of our summer reading series. So there's a question that came out of that discussion. So there's a couple of things here. So first, can programming repair harm? When an institution has caused real harm, it seems like a natural first step is to offer opportunity for public discussion, a public forum, or even programming more of a certain demographic of artist or exhibition type. But does this do what we imagine it should or could? Does it help change the institution? What are some other strategies that might be useful?
Okay, I will say this absolutely, that you cannot program your way out of racism. You just cannot. Institutions cannot program their way out of racism. They want to, they damn well want to, and they try and convince themselves and convince others that that's how they're going to address the problem. But it will never happen, right? It's because programming is supplying other forms of consumption, right? That's what it's doing. And you know, can anti-racist work by a museum happen without expanding programming to be more inclusive? No, it can't, right? Programming has to be part of it, but it's only a very small part of it, right? Yes, give artists and speakers and audiences of color more opportunities to engage the institution in ways that are meaningful to them, right? Absolutely do that. But, you know, the fact of the matter is that unless deeply structural changes happen in staffing, in pay, in the kinds of support, intellectual, professional support, in the kinds of in the sort of power of decision making, in the kinds of funding, in all of those things. You can put up as many exhibitions of Black artists or Indigenous artists or whoever that you want. It's still going to be exhibitions within an institution that is at root racist. And so, there's a really, I'm not a huge fan of all of his work, but Ibram Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning, Ibram X. Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning, is a fantastic, it's a fantastic history of racist ideas. And what he says is that people's racist attitudes didn't lead to racist institutions, right? He said racist institutions justified themselves by creating these narratives, racist narratives, right? So he says, it's not that people were racist and then they invented slavery. It's that the Portuguese really wanted to enslave Black people, and they had to convince the church that they should be allowed to enslave Black people, because the Catholic Church actually said you can't enslave people back then. And so in order to get the church to agree that they should be able to enslave Africans, they created this whole sort of pseudoscience of why people of African origin were less than human, right? So the foundation of racism was created in order to justify the institution. And then, of course, it perpetuates itself because you have, because every institution that gets built after that is built with the assumption that some people are less human than others, right? And so you have this thing where all the institutions are telling you that, some people are less, even if on the surface you don't believe it, structural and institutional racism persists because it's built on this inequality, or it's built on this sort of lie, right? And so he says, because of that, you can't that anti-racism isn't about changing attitudes, that anti-racism is fundamentally about breaking down the institutions that are built on a fundamental, justification of treating some people less than others, right? And I think that that's ultimately, and the other part he says, and this actually really got me when I heard him lecture on it. He says the way that you can tell with if an institution is racist, he said, if it employs fewer Black people than are present within the population, it's racist. Doesn't matter what the excuses are. It doesn't matter, if you say that, oh, there aren't enough people who have such and such degree, so that, we can't. It doesn't say, like, it doesn't matter if you say we don't get enough applications. It doesn't matter. Nothing matters, right? If that institution employs more white people than is justified by the population, it is a racist institution, right? Because it is benefiting and exploiting the supremacy of whiteness in a culture, right? The advantages given over to whiteness in a culture. So he says that's it. Like, that's the only question you have to ask, right? I mean, institutions that employ lots of Black people can still be racist, but no institution that employs not enough Black people can be anti-racist, right? So there, in a way, like, this is what gets me about, say, museums in the US, that museums in the US are extraordinarily white. It's a really white industry, right? And yet they're claiming to do anti-racist work. But, and there's just, until some really basic things happen so that that is not the case, so that it's not so overwhelmingly white. There is no way that anti-racist work in programming is going to have any effect, right? All it is anti-racist programming that's functioning as a cover for a fundamentally racist institution. Now, like, I do think that there are some institutions that are way too late, but they are making a huge, they are making strides. And bizarrely, in the US, the National Gallery in Washington, DC, one of the most conservative, most tradition-bound institutions, art institutions in the country, has, under its new director, gone from having no people of color on its executive team to actually a majority of Black people on its executive team, which in the US, at a US museum, other than the Studio Museum, maybe one or two others, is unheard of, right? So, I do think that there are places that are actually taking it seriously and making strides. But I think that whoever asked the question, the person who asked the question, I hope you anticipated the answer, because for me, the answer is no. Programming can't do the work. It's part of the work, maybe, but it can't, it won't unless there are structural changes. It's just window dressing.
Yeah, that's a very thorough answer. Thank you.
I have a lot to say about that.
Yeah. The idea of the right to opacity in relation to choosing your public as an academic or artist is interesting in the consumptive age of Instagram and social media. Can you be an opaque artist in the 21st century? That's a good question.
Well, that is a great question. Thank you. I think that Simone Lee is a really interesting example, because it's not that she withdraws her work from view. It's that her work presents a space of invisibility, and that she doesn't explain everything to view. If you look at her female figures, the sculptures that she makes, these figures, they have no eyes, they have no mouth, right? They are vessels often, they are structures, huts, they take on these sort of various forms, but your ability to penetrate them, or to kind of understand their secrets, is hugely delimited. They refuse to look at you, right? They refuse to look you in the eye. And I think that there's ways in which that can be metaphorical as much as it can be sort of a literal withdrawal. I think the other thing that Simone Lee's work is so smart about is that every time she has a show, she insists upon a kind of apparatus to the show, so that even if she's working in white institutions, she's actually forcing those institutions to make real space for not just her, but for other Black women. So for her Hugo Boss Prize exhibition, Loophole of Retreat, she actually convened a conference that was conceived and executed, and all its participants were Black women, right? And for a space like the Guggenheim to give its space and resources over to a conference that was all Black women, in which Black women were had the opportunity to speak to each other without worrying about translating for anyone else, who could speak to each other about the theoretical, the historical, the political, the poetic urgencies of what they wanted to talk about with each other. And anyone could come and watch, but if you were not, if you were white, if you were not Black, you could watch, you could have access, but you wouldn't be centered, right? And that's what this obligation to translate does, right? It centers whiteness as the kind of locus of understanding. It centers whiteness as the standard, the person, the white ear as the ear that needs to be able to hear, right? And in this case, it was like, people were talking and you could listen, but you had to listen from a space of humility. You had to listen from a space of, if you didn't know the reference, if you didn't know why people were talking about certain things, right? If you didn't understand all of these sort of references, that was on you to actually go and learn them, but it wasn't on anyone in that room to explain it to you. And I think that those sorts of gestures are, they're so important, and they're not, those are not things that are made available, right, to Black, to Indigenous, to other people of color. Those sorts of spaces are not often made available to artists, to thinkers, to writers, to be able to do without having to privilege whiteness as the locus of understanding, I would say.
Another question. I've been thinking about Glissant's notion on the right to opacity as something that extends to Black, Indigenous, people of color folks like myself, who refuse to allow the white and colonial gaze entry into my culture as a Palestinian person. I refuse to reveal my identity on my public biographies. I wonder if Black, Indigenous, people of color folks need more closed spaces away from this gaze.
I think absolutely. I think that there's no question that and this is where the problem is, right? The institutions who have the resources to make those spaces available, if you go to them and say, I want to do a program, but white people can sort of be in the balconies of the audience, but this is really a program for Black people or Indigenous people to take part in, and so those people can watch, they can observe, but they can't become part of the conversation. There are very few institutions, I mean, maybe more in Canada than there are in the States, I'm not sure, but there are very few institutions who want to do that, right? Because they see their audience, they see their bread and butter as mostly white. And so, there's and some of them come right out and say it, right? Like some of the institutions will come right out and say it. I think a museum director was recently fired for actually saying out loud that, yes, we're doing all this Black programming, but ultimately we recognize that white people are our most important audience. And he actually said the quiet part out loud, and he got fired for it. But it's not like he said anything that we didn't all know, right? And so I do think creating those spaces, or even if they're creating spaces that are more diverse within the spaces, creating those spaces where that we, however we define ourselves, I mean individually, I don't necessarily mean collectively, but that we can center our own thinking and our own work, rather than constantly having to translate for a sort of very voracious and colonial and extractive kind of gaze.
Yeah. I think that might be it for questions. Let me just take one last look here. Yeah, it looks like that's it for questions. So thank you again so much, Aruna. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight and also for your wonderful questions. Thanks again to Musagetes Foundation and the Arts Everywhere Festival for being our partners on tonight's talk. Please visit our website, CAFKA.21.CAFKA.org, to see a detailed list of our upcoming programming for the rest of this month and then throughout July and August as well. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Thanks so much for sharing time with me.